I'll be moderating this session. My name is Françoise Nicolas. I'm the director of the Center for Asian Studies at the French Institute of International Relations. And this session was actually suggested by our center, with Sophie also working with me on defining the topic of the session. Well, the session is not particularly original. The topic is not original. We'll be discussing about the big powers rivalry between China and the US and the impact on the rest of the world, with a focus on EU and India. And to discuss these things, we have, I think, a very diversified panel, and a good panel. There will be very different perspectives provided by the various participants, which I hope will be lively discussion. But before we start with the discussion, let me perhaps explain what I had in mind proposing this topic. Well, this is no breaking news that the current multipolar rules-based order is under stress. And the interesting thing, I think, is that it is being under attack from two sides. It's under attack from one unexpected side, which is the US. When the US was responsible for the creation of this multipolar, multilateral rules-based order, and nowadays, well, the US changed its tack and is now attacking, actually, this rules-based order. So that's one first line of attack. And the other side from which the attack is also coming is China. It's slightly different, but China does not necessarily fully fit in the system. And China also sees its importance, weight, clout, as being, well, a good reason to actually try to define its own way of organizing the world and the world order. So we have these two different forces playing at the same time. And as a result, what we had been used to having, a very stable multilateral rules-based order, is no longer working as it used to. And so the whole point of the session is to discuss this and to discuss the reaction on the part of other partners. What is the rest of the world doing in the face of this situation? And so to discuss that, we will be focusing, of course, on the EU and India. And to begin with the conversation, what I would suggest is to have perhaps an assessment or some assessment on the part of the EU participants. How do they see this rivalry? How do they perceive it? And how do they see the potential possible reaction of the EU in the face of this increasing rivalry? And to begin, so I will give the floor to Tara to start out with this European assessment, and then we'll go on and I'll explain more or less what I expect from the various people sitting next to me. So Tara, the floor is yours to provide a first initial assessment of this current situation and the possible implications for the European Union or individual EU member states, actually. So Tara, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. Can you hear me well? Thank you to Françoise. Thanks to the ORF, to Samir Saran, and to the Raisina Dialogue for keeping the EU an important topic in these discussions. We're quite far away from our continent here, and we can be absorbed by what is going on in Asia right now. We're certainly absorbed by what China is doing. I was going to say the rise of China, but I think we need to stop saying the rise of China and talk about the state of China in international affairs. And we're being questioned as well, as François said, by what we perceive as a new position of the US. A US retreat in a way, but as a retreat not just from its position in the world, but maybe a retreat as well from alliances, and typically an alliance with the EU. I don't think the drift has not gotten so far, but there are a number of instances where the EU is certainly wondering whether it might decouple part of its foreign policy and policies from the United States. I think we're seeing that very clearly in the Middle East right now, and I won't get into that, but I think the situation is a bit different in Asia, actually. I would tend to make the case for a stronger transatlantic cooperation in Asia, and particularly in the Indo-Pacific. I think Europe and the European Union is extremely affected by US-China rivalry. I think the EU is feeling pressure to pick a side, and it's not really in a position to pick a side. I think, of course, the US is its natural ally. There's the US nuclear security guarantee, the US security guarantee through NATO, typically. But at the same time, there are massive investments, massive trade relations with China. China is not an actor that we can exclude from Europe completely, but there is a new China strategy that's been implemented by the European Union, and typically a communication by the Commission released in March last year, which someone called a Copernican revolution, and I think that's quite clear. Amongst other things, the EU said that China was a systemic rival, so there was, I think, a more realistic assessment of what China and EU relationship should be. At the same time, you can't exclude one or the other. I think there is a tendency of the EU these days, especially since the vote in favor of the Brexit referendum, to be even more inward-looking, focused on internal divisions, internal issues. But the reality of the matter is the EU is a geopolitical actor, whether it wants it or not. It is perceived as such, by the way, by its rivals, Turkey, Russia, China. They definitely see the EU as a geopolitical actor, maybe a weak political actor, a weak geopolitical actor, but a geopolitical actor nonetheless. And it needs to take, I think, its rightful place in the world. This means building its sovereignty, building its strategic autonomy, using the instruments it already has in its power. The economic one being, of course, the most obvious one. But it has military power, military capacity. It can have a foreign policy. It has a global strategy. It defends a certain idea of the world. And I think the EU is quite strong. It's a lot stronger than I think it is, actually. And this is where the relationship with India comes into play. A lot of us who have been to EU-India discussions know that there's been quite a bit of frustration because this relationship hasn't come to the point where one hoped it could. There are massive similarities, 27, 28 states, as many languages, different cultures, democratic functioning with complexities, sometimes big bureaucracies. But probably the relationship, there was not enough political will to take the relationship further. I think we're seeing a change in this now, and I'm quite happy that we are. I think it makes sense for us to cooperate. It makes sense for us to cooperate in Asia. One of the sentences that you can find in the 2016 global strategy that the External Action Service released was that there were European interests in Asian security, and I think that needs to become even truer now. There is one concept that the EU can certainly work a lot more on. It's the Indo-Pacific. The idea that we need to invest with like-minded countries or entities, work with Japan, Australia, India, France a bit, to secure the region, to show that the rule of law prevails, to organize maybe freedom of navigation operations. As of now, the European Union doesn't recognize the concept of the Indo-Pacific. It's a concept that's usually presented by the US, by Japan, by France as well. The EU, as a political actor, is still using Asia-Pacific, but nonetheless, I think this is an issue that we could work on because we have capacities that are complementary, and I think it would work towards a more stable Asia, which is certainly in the interests of everyone.
Well, thank you, Tara. So perhaps to complement the assessment on the part of the EU of this new world, this new state of play in the world order, or lack of world order, actually, well, give the floor to Alica, coming from Prague all the way and landing this morning, so she may not be fully operational, she said, but I hope that she is.
Thank you for giving me voice, and thank you for giving me voice, and also the organizers for inviting me another year to come here and share my views. In terms of following up with the assessment from Tara, I'll be, I guess, concrete, because we are so tired to go through any sort of fairy tales about the EU possible role. I think EU's role has been stated on many occasions, and I think multipolarity actually gives EU an option to be an active player. And I think Tara mentioned quite clearly that EU is able to define its interests now through the global strategy, and that's been assessed on a yearly basis now. What I think happened with the current situation is that EU has become, or has to become, more realistic if it hasn't in some areas. It no longer can use probably the same approaches. I have dealt with the people who crafted and also debated the EU strategy on Central Asia last year a lot. We had a lot of discussions even from people from the region, and that clearly showed how EU realized after over a decade of having a strategy how it was not really fulfilling its purpose and didn't deliver as much as it could. This, however, also gives EU a great, I think, potential, because the latest strategy released last year is looking at the regional affairs in a more, I think, complementary way, where they can help all states rather than have a targeted approach, I think, to individual countries. So they pick 3 priorities that are surpassing borders. And this is something that gives EU an edge compared to the US or China, where their interests maybe in, let's say, Central Asia might not be the same as EU would have, you know, bring the good governance or educational, I guess, exchanges on that level that would really look at the region as a whole on a consistent long-term way. So I think this is really something that is a shake-up for EU, that it has to happen as a long-term, not just vision, but also an activity. We heard a lot about the EU values, and you know, I always think, is the EU really equipped to promote some of these values? And I think it failed in some ways to have the one-size-fits-all approach. And I think even with India, when we, I guess, get into this discussion later, and we will explore the differences in approaches, they will not find always convergence in applying certain rules of game. What EU actually, what this helps EU is the reassessment, reflection. And I think EU can really, from this point, and has been taking the role of a multilateral player, showing that that's the stable environment where the codes of conduct can be debated, but also countries can be called upon if they don't comply. And I think we need this kind of policing in a way, and that's often overlooked. If you don't support multilateralism and organizations, then, you know, you can't have these mechanisms in place. And I think this is the role of EU. Another one would be, I think, the diplomatic dialogue. We have often sanctions on states in some ways, and or, you know, stop interacting with countries in a very abrupt way. And I think EU can be more positive in certain dialogues that might not be happening otherwise. Regionalism, I think, is a big complementary element because it clearly defines the roles of states, but also appreciates the context of the region as a whole, and everybody, the external players, have to comply to certain codes of conduct. We have the case from Central Eastern Europe, and then Western Europe have a different discussion on engagements with China, with the 17+1, a fear of sort of disputing the standards that we have in EU. And I think this is very important to have a seat in Brussels, somebody who will take you back to the table and say, listen, you subscribe to certain standards. You can't now choose to overlook in your trade deals. So I think this is important to have, if there is competition, that it has to be done under certain conditions. And also, I think the flexibility in, like you said, there are 20 plus states, you know, we still have more members than, and you know, these discussions are ongoing about who's in, who's out. But we have all these voices, and there is a certain element of flexibility, and it shows that certain agreements are done in such a remarkable fashion. And I think this is important to de-escalate certain disputes because, you know, we can, let's say, ASEAN's way is very calm in a way that don't bring the sensitive issues to the table. I think Europe is able to bring the sensitive issues to the table, but still find some agreements and in a sort of civilized manner. And it suits to certain region, might not suit to other region. So this is just me saying that EU can be a constructive player now if it chooses to, but of course we need to wait whether it's going to be inward-looking or also take this global strategy to that practical level.
Okay, well, thank you. Mine are my takeaways from these first two interventions is that, after all, well, it's actually good for the EU that there is such a mess outside, because then the EU is able to define its own interests much better than in the past. Well, we may call that strategic autonomy or European sovereignty. You call it whatever you want. But this is one result of this new situation, and that can be seen as rather positive for the EU. Okay, now let's move on to India with Salma. So provide us with your own assessment of this new reality outside, and how does India respond to that, or at least perceive that, and how define its own policy?
Thank you, Francois, and I'd like to thank the MEA and the ORF for the opportunity to be here. So a very old EU watcher, today let me put on the India part of it. For India and Indian foreign policy, the world does not exist in binaries. I don't think we have the luxury. It's never been the way the MEA has, drafted foreign policy. It's a foreign policy which has concentric circles, so which means the near geography and the extended geography have always been influencing factors in India's foreign policy map. Having said that, I think what you face in the current context, to make it more topical to what we're discussing, I think what we're seeing is the emergence of global and regional ecosystems which are providing opportunities for both competition and cooperation. The larger question to frame it is, where does then India fit into this? How does India see what is being played out at the regional space, and where does India then find itself in the larger global kind of it? Why do I say that India does not have the luxury of thinking in binaries? Because in the region itself, India, China is a neighbor. There is no way you can exclude the neighbor from all your decision making. It has a gravitas which is bearing on the everyday. And as we speak, the trade component of the bilateral relation has grown tremendously, right? So it also tells you the kind of penetration the Chinese trade has acquired over here, the exposure to the trade that is happening. It's building its own set of relationships. I know a neighbor who at this moment is in China picking up machinery. That's a reality you have to look at. And you could pick up the newspaper and read another kind of reality on the border, right? So we still have an open border with China that is being discussed. So that is a reality, which means that you can't think of an either or. It's not about choosing, on whose side you are. It's about choosing what you prioritize on that set of relationship with that particular country. I think that's, to put it in a way, it's very different from the way EU would be looking at it. It can't be just reduced to a normative redux and said, let's look at it from a normative point of view, because that would raise its own set of questions. So what does New Delhi do in this changed circumstance? Well, the one thing is that, we've seen in the post-Cold War period an opportunity open up for New Delhi to engage the United States very differently. We've moved from being estranged democracies to being engaged democracies, and you can see the strategic partnership which has evolved out of this. On the side with China, you've just seen the Prime Minister have an informal summit, with his Chinese counterpart, all to tell you that there is a constant interplay of managing what is coming out in terms of what the reality is producing and the kind of expectations these interactions also create. So that means there are these different, engagements which need to be brought into play. So what does it focus on? And I think there, if I look at it from the India-EU part of it, it's not that China is onto this relationship, right? So the India-EU relationship stands by itself It is a composite relationship made up of two components. At one level, there is the relationship with the member states, and at the same time, from 2004, you also have a strategic partnership that both sides, have, and this is expanding and growing. The often, complaint which would come from New Delhi on the India-EU in this specific context is the EU's overwhelming preoccupation with China. And of course, a large part of that comes from the fact of the economy. So the Chinese economy is the critical actor in this part, and India has often felt lectured, by the European Union at a normative level. So that's very interesting that, one side gets to experience trade and the other side gets to experience lectures, right? So when you square it off and you say, hey, listen, but the addition doesn't work out, because if India is a democracy and we are cognizant and mindful of rights, then why do we need a lecturing? So I think a genuine partnership, is based on accepting what the other side is. And I think that has changed a little bit now, right? So there is a maturing which we're seeing. I think we should read it in tandem with, like François, you said, I mean, the disorder is producing an opportunity, but that also produces a cost. And the question to ask is, who is going to bear the cost? In the morning today, for our, people here in the room, we had an India-EU session in which we discussed extensively on it. There was also a talk, today on who will underwrite in the opening session of the Raisina, who will underwrite security today? And it was said that India will play an important role. You can't do it alone. There's a lot of expectation from the EU as well. But the very important question over here, and I'd like to conclude on that, is the issue of capacity, right? So, I mean, if you're going to be partners in providing what we would call as global public goods, then you can't say, I will do it in a one-off manner. It has to be sustained, it has to be committed, and it has to constantly deliver, right? So that means you have to also be able to manage your internal transitions and preoccupations, but also be able to deliver at the foreign policy table and be actively delivering it. So those are the kind of what we would call as the capability expectation gap, which will get created. So I would take this and give it back to you, François, and saying, well, there is a moment in which disorder is, defining it, but that could be a starting point. What's important is, how do you take a 50-year-old partnership forward as a moment in which you recognize each other as partners, in which case you would, get the agenda state. And I think you wouldn't define it by looking at a G2 or a binary. I think then that way you would limit yourself to what you can actually do.
Well, thank you, Salma. Well, you just touched very briefly on possible cooperation or convergence between the EU and India. So, and I would like to hand over to Solomon to perhaps provide his views on the possible cooperation areas between EU and India in this new context that we just described. So, Solomon, over to you.
Thank you, moderator. I join everybody who is thankful, Raisina, for inviting us for such an impressive gathering, and in addition to extend condolences for the avalanche in Kashmir. Maybe many people are touched by this in this region. In contrast with most of the speakers here, I'm not a political scientist scholar. I'm coming rather from realpolitik, learning the things by doing. I wouldn't say that I learned them, but I tried to do them. I was Minister of Foreign Affairs in my country, and from this experience I would like to share three ideas on how we can enhance cooperation between India and the European Union, or India and the West in general. The first thing is that, which came from my experience in the ministry, is that one topic is as important for one ministry as many people we are asking to work on it. The topic, the importance of the topic is proportional of the number of people which are operating on this topic. In front of me is our able ambassador here, with whom we were working 24 years now, and she can tell you that Whenever we were on the Security Council of the United Nations, we put most of our efforts there. When we were chairing OSCE, we put most of our efforts there. When we had difficult problem to solve with Colonel Gaddafi in Libya, we put most of our efforts there, etc., etc., etc. So my first idea to be shared between the European Union and India is to put more people working on bilateral relations. I tried to detect on how many people are working at this moment, and this is, to my taste, much, much, much below what is desired number. And this is objective. Second idea that I wanted to share at this intriguing forum is the security. India has always been interested in security affairs because of the problems with the neighbors, because of number of things, because of its size, because of its future, because it deserves it. And I want to share with our Indian hosts that what we see in Europe, many of us, not everybody of course, is that cybersecurity will be the backbone of future security in Europe. And more precisely, not only cybersecurity, but the development of the 5G net. The 5G grid would be certainly of a crucial importance for decades ahead for what we call security. It is not by coincidence that NATO decided very recently that the cyberspace becomes area of operations of NATO, as the space is becoming space of operations of NATO. And this was the second idea, to develop Europe-India enhanced cooperation in cybersecurity and in particular in 5G. And the third idea which I wanted to share here in New Delhi is the following. You know our organization NATO, which is so to say half American, 40% American, 60% European. Let's say it is 50-50. NATO is the organization which takes care for security in Europe, and due to this organization, we have now, for the first time in the history of Europe, 70 years without major continental war. For the first time after Jesus Christ, we have 70 years without major continental war. Because of what? Because of the existence of the transatlantic bridge, because of the cooperation between Europe and North America. What I would like to suggest to be discussed at respective governmental and non-governmental levels is to create a NATO-India Council. We have at this moment NATO-Russia Council, which doesn't work very well. We have NATO-Ukraine Commission, which tries to work. But what we really need for the strategic future is to develop relations between NATO as such and India. This, of course, will bring additional power to India in the international scene. I listened this morning to the EU-India conference in the other room. People were asking, well, why India was not invited to be partner in the negotiations between West and Iran. If we have this council, NATO-India Council, I can assure you that the role of India in such international affairs where the West is active will be quite different. Or, for example, we very well know and respect India's ambitions to become one day a permanent member of the Security Council of the United Nations. This, if the reform is to take place, this is supposed to happen, but being 2 years on this council and chairing it twice, I can tell you that I do not see for the rest of my lifetime reform in the Security Council of the United Nations. And when I urge for such a move, NATO-India Council, I hasten to remark that this is not something which is directed against China. On the contrary, I think, and I have said, what I'm speaking now for India, I share for the first time, and the first person to whom I told this in public is our former Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen, who was speaker this morning. But this is not something directed against China. On the contrary, for quite different reasons, I think that that NATO has to develop similar or parallel relations with China. And I had the opportunity to discuss this several times in Beijing when I was invited by the Chinese government. And I will come once again to the first topic for the more people that are needed for the India-Europe relations. The European Union is a very complicated matter. Very complicated matter. Not many people in Europe understand the European Union. We have Council with President, Commission with President, Parliament with President, European External Action Service with HRVP, whatever it means. And now, to make the things even more complicated, we have a second commissioner who is responsible for foreign affairs, in addition to President Borrell, whom I hope to see here tomorrow. So it is a really very complicated thing, and we need a lot of people to realize it. I see here in the room one of the very active builders of the European Union, Karel Bildt. Maybe he has such a name because he's a builder of the European Union, and I'm sure that he can tell you how insignificant number of people in Europe understand Europe. So do not rely that two people in the Foreign Ministry of India will understand this complicated structure. Put more people and more efforts in it.
Well, thank you, Solomon. That's very reassuring because myself, I have some trouble understanding Europe, so apparently I'm not the only one, so that's reassuring. Okay, well, I'll go back to Salma perhaps for some reactions onto to these very concrete proposals made by Solomon about the possible areas for cooperation between the two partners. So over to you, Salma, before we then listen to the Chinese reaction to all these ideas.
Yeah. So on the quick comment on cooperation, I mean, there is already a very long list which is there. So in 2005, a joint action plan was developed between India and EU, to identify areas of possible cooperation. It was reviewed in 2008, and post-Lisbon and all of it, there is a revisiting. And I think on the European Union side, there is a revisiting because the India strategy was launched a year back. You've given three very concrete comments, suggestions, and let me pick it up. The first thing, you're very right in saying an undercapacity would mean that there is a lack of, sustenance to support something in long term. On the Indian side, this is an oft-stated criticism that our capacity of the foreign ministry is extremely limited. And if you want to have that kind of a role globally and also to, keep the India-EU relationship going, your point is very well taken on board. That can be done. One way of doing capacity augmentation would be a lateral entry, which the Indian side can engage with. On the EU side, I think the capacity is there. The question is not about capacity. The question is what are the priorities for Brussels? And I think the priorities for Brussels has been Beijing for a very long time. It is now being seen that New Delhi is figuring on it. So I would see that on the European side, it's probably not a lack of capacity, but a lack of priority. I would say that. Cybersecurity, I totally take your point on board. I think we are increasingly in a world which is about hybrid threats. The challenge for us is in our geography of the world, we still have classical traditional threats. And at the same time, we are also technologies introducing the cyber and the hybrid threats. So India, in that sense, has to address both. For Europe, as you said, NATO has guaranteed security for 70 years. It's an unprecedented era of peace which has come. But you also have now the rise of hybrid threats, which means that you don't know where the next threat comes from, right? And I think that is where I would totally take on board that there is a very good opportunity for India and the European Union to engage. On the NATO issue, NATO-India Council, I would be extremely skeptical about this. Why do I say that? NATO was in the neighborhood when all this crisis was happening in Afghanistan. Many feelers were sent out, but New Delhi has refused to even acknowledge and engage with it. More recently, there is a certain opening up. I personally thought that talking to NATO would not be a problem, but I think it is the historical location of NATO, created in 1949, and all that it stands for as a Cold War institution anchoring security in Europe, meant that New Delhi did not have an appetite to engage with NATO. Maybe things are changing. I think it's important to also know which other actors are there in town and what is their gig and what is that producing. So maybe at some point, a council would be institutionalizing a relationship, which also has to start with first acknowledging that there is this kind of an actor which is present. So I think a first step would be even an informal kind of a meeting to even understand. So I think that kind of readiness has not yet taken place. But maybe on the sidelines, there could be meetings, right? And I think that idea could be opened up. Francois, back to you.
Thank you, Salma. All right, so, well, I guess that now we have to hear the Chinese voice. Well, so, Chunhao, what do you make out of all this? I mean, how do you react to these various proposals and to the assessment that was also given of this new situation? Do you perceive the things in the same way, or, how do you react to all this?
Okay, okay, thank you, Chair. First, I'd like to convey my thanks to being invited by the OIF to participate in the Raisina Dialogue. And especially I feel honored because to participate in these panels, because all the other panels are either European experts or experts on Europe. But and the topic is about the EU and India, but I'm a Chinese. Anyway, I'd like to share my views. Just now, all the other panelists have shared their view about the China-US relationship. And in the overview of this panel, it also raised that China and the US loudly proposing the zero-sum models of globalization. And two other panelists have mentioned the word of the rivalry. So first, I would like to share my personal view about the current China-US relationship or the Chinese understanding about the overall situations. I think that first I would like to emphasize that this kind of the zero-sum or game or the rivalries are not frequently used in China, and it's not our strategic culture, not in our way of thinking. For example, if you want to understand Chinese way of thinking, you always know that yin-yang is quite opposite, but we see that yin and yang, we can coexist in harmony. So I think that even nowadays, when some American politicians labeled, or even the government documents labeled China as a revisionist power, strategic competitor, etc., or deliver some kind of the speeches with Cold War features, etc. But in China, if you read the Chinese literatures, whether it's academic or the government documents, the rivalry or this zero-sum game are seldomly used. We use the word maybe academically, mainly as a maneuvering or the interaction. So we think that now the bilateral relationship between China and the US, we are in a transitional stage. Maybe through keep on more extensive interaction, we can find the new model of interaction in future. Maybe the old model is not will not work anymore, but it does not mean that we will evolve to the Cold War or just the rivalry situation. So this is the first point I would like to share. The second point I would like to share is that on Chinese perception on the EU and India, I think that it's a fact that China challenged our relationship or our cooperation with the EU and India very much. Not only from a realist perspective, EU and India are very important strategic power actor, whether it's weak or strong. But we think that in the multipolar world, EU and India, you also have some kind of the normative power, some kind of the you can, communicate or through with different actors in this interconnected and interdependent world. So I think that just now all the other panelists listed some kind of areas of cooperation. I think that I fully agree with them, and I think that not only EU and India, but maybe also China can also join in this kind of cooperation. In later 2018, I think the Chinese government released the latest white paper on our policy towards EU, and now we also have the informal summit with India. So I think this also sends a signal that we hope that through some kind of cooperation, we can play some kind of the role in safeguarding the current order. And I think finally is that as to the points, suggestions, just now some professors have mentioned, including the minister, I think that this can be summarized as three areas, or to address the three deficit or three disorders. One is about the trust deficit, which mainly because derived from the power imbalance, or power rebalance because of the rise of China, because of the rise of the India. I think the old power balance situation may be changed, and this creates some kind of the deficit, trust deficit, particularly from US against China. The other kind of the deficit we can address is about the development deficit. That is how to reform the current system to address correctly the issues that may be created by the current system. For example, the globalization. China and India and many countries will benefit from the globalization, but on the other hand, we have to also admit that the globalization created some kind of problems. So how to address these kind of problems? How to together we can work towards the involvement or the transition or the reform of the current system. The other area is about the new issues. Minister Solomon has mentioned about the cyber, and some experts mentioned about the maritime governance. Actually, I think that we also hope that we can adjust this kind of the governance deficit. That is, the old system, the old governance system may not deal with this kind of challenges caused by technology and by the extension of the human activity, etc. So I think that, for example, China and Europe, we already have this kind of the blue partnership on the ocean governance, and the EU has released its document, its first time, on the global ocean governance. So on the cyber, I think the same happens. So how to extend our cooperation in the new domains? In China, we call it new domains, such like the cyber, the outer space, etc. So I think that not only EU and India, maybe all the other relevant powers, we should work together to address this kind of deficit, to address this kind of the disorder, so that we can have a more rule-based order. But what I also have to mention that this kind of the rule-based order have to be inclusive. It should not be ideological or just some countries' ideology, value system driven. Otherwise, it will be exclusive. Thanks.
Well, thank you. So China wants to play the multilateral game. Well, that's good to know in a number of areas that we all suggested before. Any reactions on the part of the panelists before I hand over to the floor? Yes. So briefly, Aitza, and anybody else?
I just have a few brief comments. When we spoke about the EU-India interaction, I think it was a bit in isolation, as if India wasn't really interacting with China in any formats, but it is in BRICS and SEO. And I think what's important to say, even India's approach to some interactions is more moderate than EU's, let's say, in terms of restricting participation of Russia. So I think they can nicely complement each other in some ways. And also India has played a vocal critic within SEO in terms of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative and some activities in the larger region. So I think this is something we can overlook, that India is working with Russia, is working with China on a different formats. Sometimes we call them like alternative, but I think they are just natural development and they suit certain regions. Another one that we don't talk often, and it is something that is in all documents, is this people-to-people relations. And I think we create all these programs on education and healthcare, and we don't really have interactions. I meet people from India from these workshops. I don't really meet the local people, often enough. And I think unless we start to do this kind of interactions when we are in the country, we can never really comprehend how it works and what is necessary. So I think that is important, and the same goes for people, let's say, from India coming to Europe and engaging in our regions. So I think this is an ongoing. Another one they can work on is obviously environment. We all need that, and that was mentioned many times. And I think I'll just stop.
Salma?
Two quick points. I think if you're framing a discourse on two factors over here, multipolarity and multilateralism, then I think what we're witnessing is a collective rise of many. But it's not going to be an absolute change of power which is happening. I think there's a relative decline of some and there's a rise of the other. I think what is important is what was said by my Chinese colleague over here, is about what is the nature of the rules-based order, because I think that's where something India also has concerns, right? I mean, on some institutions we were part of it, right from 45, what we would call the Bretton Woods institution, and on the others you're experiencing that India is both a status quoist and it's also pushing for change, which also reflects, where it finds itself, caught between two very different kind of places where it lacked a capacity, and it would be the rule absorber or the rule taker. But as its capacities change and as India, grows, it also wants a change. It also wants a recognition. And I think that status quo will have to give at some point. If it doesn't give, what you will see is a parallel building of systems taking place, which will undermine the larger UN framework. So I think that would be important to us. That, and in that context, I would, in some of my writings, have said that I have looked at EU also as an emerging power. When you frame it that way, then you're able to understand how the EU itself has grown from economics driving the union to where today foreign and security policy is also a core component of the EU. So just
Well, yeah, thank you, Salma. Okay, over to you, Salma.
Two brief comments. All other institutions that NATO does not pay great attention to its image. NATO is not an image-making institution, and I'll give you a very interesting example which came to my mind when I saw President Karzai today in the hall. In 2004, Bulgaria had a large military unit in Afghanistan, and I visited the unit, and President Karzai invited me for a dinner, and I proposed to him an idea which Bulgarian farmers told me. They told me, look, the soil in Afghanistan is very similar to the soil in Bulgaria. And what we are doing here in Bulgaria are great producers of rose oil. And they told me, you can suggest to the president to start planting Bulgarian rose oils to eradicate the poppy croppings. And when we proposed this to President Karzai, he was very open-minded, immediately said, yes, we found German money, of course German money in the European Union, there are no other money than German. And with the German money and the Bulgarian know-how, we developed this rose oil, Bulgarian rose oil made in Afghanistan. And 7 years later, I witnessed at the Green Week festivities in Berlin, the first drop of Bulgarian rose oil made in Afghanistan. Well, we did not eradicate all of the poppy croppings, but something was done. And why I'm telling this? Because if NATO was an image-making institution, it would flag this success story instead of 1,000 soldiers which we have there. And I would like also to excuse myself and to apologize to Salma for the frequent lecturing. This is really a matter not of differences, but this is a matter of Western arrogancy. We have it, and please take it much easier. Actually, the European Union and India has much more to do vis-a-vis Hong Kong, vis-a-vis Taiwan, things like this. The differences are relatively negligible than the big things that are uniting us.
Yeah, we're sorry for the lecturing. It's an inherent characteristic, I'm afraid. Oh, you want to add something before I open to the floor? Okay, so yeah, just one.
Just half a minute, because just now Alessa had mentioned about the people-to-people relationship contact. I think that this is also what the point that China emphasizes more. Because now China and India, we have the high-level mechanism, and China and France, we have also similar mechanism. And on our policy, white paper policy on the EU, there are 4 pillars. One is about the civilization. I mean, people-to-people contact. So, and the biggest challenge or the danger for the current China and EU relationship is that because of the decoupling of the people-to-people contact. Because many Chinese scholars, when they visit the US, their visas will be cancelled, and I will not give more details. Thanks.
We have to open the floor to the open to the floor, and I also already see one hand raised. So Timothy, and to my right, ladies first. Timothy, you don't mind? Okay. No. No, but it's a very female panel, so please.
Good evening. My name is Esther Brimmer. I am now the head of NAFSA, the Association of International Educators, but in previous stages of my life, spent a lot of time on transatlantic relations and also on emerging powers. And so I would like to ask a little bit more about the appetite for defending global spaces, and to flag 3 in particular that have come up, but just talk a little bit more about exactly, concretely, what the EU and India might do. The first, of course, is has been mentioned in terms of navigation, freedom of navigation, and the seas, classic global spaces, exactly specifically where you might see greater cooperation in that area. The second, of course, is in the cybersecurity area, again, that's been touched on, but exactly what might be interesting in particular might be on norms, on uses of human dignity, to refer to our themes from earlier today, in cyberspace. Obviously, the European Union has quite a lot to say about that. The GDPR has affected all of us around the globe, so a little bit more in that area as well. And finally, in outer space, both the European Union and India are major space powers as well. There are important challenges in terms of how we manage, again, a global space, which is outer space. I'm interested in all those 3 areas. Thank you.
Thank you. So should we take another question, and then we go back to the panelists? So 2 other questions. Timothy? Yes, please.
Okay, maybe like that. Well, thank you. Well, I did like our presentations very much, and I think that the European Union and India have a tremendous potential for cooperation, and we actually want to see all parts of a wider Eurasia to be incorporated in the common cooperative structures and platforms, and to achieve the peace in our common space. Well, but at the same time, I, as a good student in my past, 25 years ago, as a good student of European integration, I was in '96 trained. I was the first Russian to be trained as a European Union bureaucrat in Bruges. So, based on this background, I am afraid that every integration, especially of such a profound nature as a European integration, is a project which is supposed to take care about the citizens of the countries which are the member states of this integration. And every institution of such integration should do its best to the citizens of these countries, regardless of the impact on the relationships with the other countries, with the other partners, mostly regardless. So, do you believe that there might be certain internal incorporated institutional limitations to the European Union which will restrict the possibilities of cooperation between European Union and developing economy like India? This is the first question. The second question to our Indian friends, actually. I read recently in Politico online magazine that the new head of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, proposed the European Green Deal, which is also envisaging the tools such as a carbon border tax, European Union tariffs on imported goods based on their CO2 footprint, these instruments could be seen as, by some of the observers, as protectionist measures, and even violation of the WTO rules, for example. So my question to Indian friends, how do you see from India this new environmental agenda of the European Union, which is considered by some observers as a protectionist and directed against the aspirations of growing economies? Thank you.
Thank you, Timofey. Sophie, you want to ask a question?
Very short comment. So what I understood from this panel is that we are in a very difficult context with old and new challenges, with old architecture to deal with these challenges, so that it's not functional because we have to deal also with new challenges. And listening to you, I was thinking, it's just wishful thinking because one term is missing, and Salma, when you talk about a genuine partnership, I said that's it, because you said genuine partnership is based on an acceptance of what the other part is. Well, I'm not that sure. I think genuine partnership is based on trust, and never I heard the word trust. So how can we build, a new security system, to deal with these challenges if we do not have trust? And excuse me, but wherever I go, and I talk to people, there is no trust in the system. There is no trust among partners. So, where are we going to?
Thank you, Sophie, for this philosophical question. But I think, no, it's an important question indeed, but it goes back to one major issue, which is definition gaps. We may be using the same words, but not meaning exactly the same things. And when, yeah. No, I understand what you say, but when we talk about partnership, indeed, we may have something slightly different in our heads. And this may be problematic. Anyway, so let's go back to the 3 sets of questions that were asked. So who wants to address the first set with the global spaces? Okay.
Sure. I won't answer them all, but I'll try to give a few answers. On the first one, defending global spaces, I fully agree. I think that's definitely several areas that India and the EU could work on. One term that we didn't use so much as well in this roundtable until now is non-alignment. I was lucky enough to hear a few weeks ago the Indian foreign minister say that actually India was moving away from non-alignment and becoming multi-aligned. We don't know exactly what that means. It's not clear, but it does mean that India knows its place in the world is changing. It needs to be talking to different powers, several. I think the way India is trying to find its place between the US and Iran right now also demonstrates that. So it's still practicing. I don't think it has all of the answers, but certainly it's thinking about who are the partners on which topic that it can be aligned with, and it doesn't see it as being contradictory, clearly. So I think that's part of the answer. Genuine partnership and trust. I don't think I agree. If there was trust everywhere, we wouldn't need security orders. I think it's precisely because sometimes we know there is no trust between partners that we need to put a number of parameters around. I don't think in an ideal world, we would trust one another, and I hope that the EU and India are partners that trust one another. But if you look at other contexts, we implement security orders because we know that trust doesn't exist. So I think this is something that we need to be wary about. On the Green Deal and it being protectionist, I had this conversation precisely this morning with an Indian official. I think, they do see it as being protectionist. I don't think that means they believe it's against their own interests. I think they understand now that this is an issue that matters quite a bit to the European Union. It's defining, in a way, the priorities of this new European Parliament. I think this is an issue that the climate change issue and development of the green economy is also important to India, and it sees the Green Deal as a challenge, but I don't think it believes it's against its interests. So that would be my answer.
So I'd like to thank on the issue of, offering these global spaces as points of cooperation between India and the EU. I think there's been a process of a think tank twining initiative between India and the EU, and that readily showed exactly these areas which are being worked upon. At this point, it's not coming out very vociferously at a policy level, but what you did see was there is a very good scope for enhancing cooperation in maritime security, keeping the sea lanes of navigation open. And India also, was part of, coming forward, overcoming its hesitation, and being part of the World Food Programme in escorting a ship. Cybersecurity, I think we've heard a lot about it today, and the EU's GDPR has obviously been a benchmarking. I think the first time when I think in the context of new norms and rules and regulation, the EU definitely is ahead of the others, because this has massive implications for others to follow through. And you could see a footprint of that also on India's own cyber law, which is coming up. Outer space, I think it's extremely important. We've gone beyond the third realm, the fourth domain, and we are already in the fifth domain. And the growing militarization of it is happening even as we speak. I mean, the fact whether we talk of a new requirement for a new missile regime would also, be predicated on it, that how would you find workable solutions to have any of these regimes. So I think those are very well taken, and hopefully the next summit between India and EU should see some of this resonate over there. On the issue of the green economy, well, there would be only one word I would have for it. Is it at this point something which the EU is, toying with the idea? Every commission wants to come out with its own flagship, establish itself, what is so unique it created and produced, and the current anxiety and angst with climate change is real at one level. But if that would be the case, to have this carbon tax, then I think EU is back to its old game of NTBs, non-tariff barriers, right? And I think that would not stand for scrutiny in the WTO. So I would not jump and say that, it's a done thing, and therefore, but let the wait and see as to what really comes out of it. How much does it actually translate from, a statement which is there for consumption? On the last point on trust, Sophie, what you said, I think on the India-EU, it's a relationship which has grown in very different ways. Over here, I think, there's been a lot of emphasis on values. Every summit, every document you take out, there's a reiteration in the opening paragraph of the values that you can literally close your eyes and repeat it. The point is, why doesn't it go forward? And I think at this point, it's very important to recognize values are good, but the way values manifest themselves are extremely different. Your geography will have a far-reaching influence on what you can do or not do with your values. And I think, therefore, it's important to shift to talking about interest, right? And when you talk about interest, then you get a lot more, possibilities to cooperate. And I think that is where then a trust building will take place between both. There is a certain amount of trust which is built up between the member states. But I think I take your point on board because New Delhi doesn't have a preferred option to do business with Brussels. It still looks at member states as being where. So that means still in the old kind of a pattern, because that's how things are in this part of the world. Still very sovereignty-bound states as the primary actors. So recognizing the EU as the new source has taken some time, but I think it has happened well, because now the EU has gone into the portfolio of the External Affairs Minister. And to just conclude on that, Minister Jaishankar identified 3 Cs, for the Indian foreign policy. He's talking about the coexistence of, competition, convergence, and cooperation all coexisting together. So which means that it is not exclusive, but it could be also that with one single player also in that bilateral, all the 3 Cs can exist. Then you want to see that, okay, what kind of possibilities are there to ameliorate the competition, but enhance the convergence with this actor, if you're talking about, global public goods, for example.
I'll try to make brief comments. The first one was about protecting citizens and pretty much whether there is institutional capacity and limitations. And I think often what happens is, as a EU citizen, I find that we often have this tendency to say us versus them, us, and we sometimes forget that we are EU. And so what we put in is what we get out of it. And I hardly hear internally a lot of talk about the EU. It's people who are enthusiastic about it will bring it up. And I think the limitation then happens that we look at the domestic issues at first and then what is better for the greater EU as a whole. So I think until we adapt that identity, and it's not going to happen because some states are looking at the EU as a supranationalist and some intergovernmentalist. So I think, there is the limitation, institutional limitation, and I don't know if that can be overcome. But also that reduces the trust in the institution, because if the people who are in leadership of your countries do not put forward EU as the mechanism that we should look at in our interaction, then common citizen or anyone can trust that mechanism. In terms of I think that was a great comment about the trust. I often thought when I was based in Australia for a long time, and when I went to workshops there was often, let's say China was actually explaining in early stages, I'm talking 2007, 2008, what's the difference between confidence building measures and trust building measures, and how we come with checklists from some of the Western countries, and we trust you, that's why we are here, and we have to get this done. And they would say, well, we need interactions before we start trusting you. And I think like you said, the definition is so important, and I think we still find this. And in terms of interactions with India, I can see how on the top level there is the declaration and will to do something together. But if you don't know, let's say, those who will execute, the companies, the associations, that trust has to be formed, and I think that's the missing link, having more engagements on the institutional level that are not governments as well. So I agree with you that this is going deeper and it has to be reconciled somehow. And I think it also links to the common spaces, because, those are very sensitive environments, space and cyber. You have to open up your activities quite openly. And I think you need to first have some sort of interaction on a very trustworthy level to actually have that common approach, because we know even in Europe certain states are part of the more elite group of intelligence sharing, and not everybody is in that club. So how can we expect that suddenly somebody from Europe will have that in with country that is, in Asia? So I think it is all linked to more interactions and so forth.
Thank you. Anybody else, or can we bring it to a close? Yeah, because I'm afraid we are. Oh, yes. Okay, that will be the last question, because otherwise we'll be running behind schedule. So please.
Sorry, I don't want to extend it much longer than it has to be, but I was provoked by something that Madame Bava said. It is about at least I believe it's just a suspect till now. You said that the EU is trying to implement some non-tariff barriers, maybe. I cannot agree with you. I don't want to agree with you. And I don't believe this way of thinking is helping very much the India itself. Because whatever the EU is doing in its interactions with India, it is from the point of view of a long history of achievements that the EU achieved for its citizens, like in terms of standards of living, of healthcare, name it. So that way of thinking from Indian side, that probably the EU tries to implement some non-tariff or whatever barriers, talking to India, it doesn't help a lot. It doesn't help us to reach the FTA, what we so much need between us. It is going so difficult between us. Why do we need to have this suspect between us?
Well, I'm afraid it all goes back to the trust issue, precisely. Yeah. If you immediately interpret, a measure taken by your partner as being something fishy or with, an ulterior motive or something like this, then it's just a simple proof that there is no trust. So it all boils down to this trust thing. Yeah. But I agree with you that naming these measures taken by the EU as automatically an non-tariff barrier, and I'm not sure that would fly with the WTO. I'm not sure. And anyway, the WTO being brain dead, you can always go to the WTO and try to argue with it, but you won't get anything out of it. But I would tend to side on your side rather than Salma's. I'm sorry for that. But if you go to Geneva with this case, I'm not sure that you will get what you want.
Well,
I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, I think it was just a response to a question raised that perhaps the EU is saying. And I said one would have to wait and see how it translates. It's not yet there. And I think when you say that the EU is made for its citizens, we should also recognize that in every country, at least in India, I can talk about India, even our constitution squarely starts, we the people of India. So, it is also the citizens at the forefront. And standards are something which should not be used as a measuring rod to see who fits in and who doesn't fit, because it is also about how, development is unequal. It takes time. And it is a task which also will have different repercussions. This does not mean to say that India is not mindful or cognizant of environment. Probably it's one country in the world, and many Indians who are here in the room will recognize it. Every Sunday morning, we have the world's largest recycling exercise happening at your doorstep, even before you wake up. You're woken up by the sound of a person going around on a cycle who's coming to pick up old newspaper and bottles and glass and what have you. And this has been going on for ages, right? So at the same time, with industrialization, with growth and all the other kind of things, things are coming in. Companies also come to sell you technology. So I would not want to say that we are wanting to have lesser standards. The citizens are at the center, just like they are for the European Union. The citizens are also at the center over here. But I would not get into an argument where standards becomes the point where we come and break down, that, your standard is less. You cannot achieve a standard like that for a billion-plus population overnight. It takes time. At the same time, I think we are constantly, Delhi has gone in for the ban of single-use plastic. Till last year over here, in the Raisina, there were little water bottles which were kept out. People have not, those who were here last year would recognize. Little bottles which everybody picked and left a pile of water bottles, tiny ones. They've shifted to glass. So this also shows that this is not coming from something just external. This is also happening from dialogues and things happening over here, the mindfulness. So I would hope not, as the colleague on the other side said, this tax coming with a carbon footprint, because that would not take us anywhere. It would lead us to the kind where instead of building cooperation, we would have to find solutions. Today, it was said also, you can't fight global challenges singularly. Nobody can. But if everybody contributes, we can. So I think I think India and EU are on the same page. But we can't immediately set a timeline and say it has to be done tomorrow. I think everybody will have to take a little bit of that. So I would hope what you said is not something which is happening, because that would be difficult. Then the first thing will be a dialogue like this cannot take place. You will have to do it on a virtual format. Everybody got on a flight and came here, right? And so think of the carbon emissions everybody contributed, right? So I think we will also have to revisit how we look at some of it. It doesn't mean that airlines are going to stop doing business, but we probably have to ask, what does it mean for all of us? How do we reconfigure what we do? How do we all take and contribute to that? That would be very important. So I'm hoping that is something which the new commission will not actually bring, but these are challenges. I mean, going green is something which is also part of the discourse over here. The investment in solar, the International Solar Alliance is also a signal where India is diversifying its energy basket, recognizing that we also have to reduce. It cannot be just an agenda set outside to reduce the carbon emission. Ultimately, if something goes bad, if the quality of air in Delhi is bad, the citizens of Delhi pay for it first before anybody else. So I think we're all mindful about that. But I would be very, and this is where I said the lecturing part of it, that it's not that we are not aware of standards, and we are getting introduced to standards for the first time from somebody from outside. That, I think, to my mind, comes back to the issue, Sophia, what you said about trust, and then partners don't dictate standards. I think that would be important.
Well, thank you, Salma. Well, I think you will all agree that even if we didn't solve all the problems, I think it was a very interesting discussion and that we got very much food for thought. And I guess the very latest exchange proves that. So thank you